everybody. Okay, this is going to be the start of the series of lessons on the Conflict and Tension 1918 to 1935 AQA GCSE unit. So we're going to start with the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. We're going to go through the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations, the 1920s, the 1930s, the rise of Hitler, and then the road to World War II. So we are going to start with looking at who the big three were and what their aims were at the Paris Peace Conference, which is another name for the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Okay, so we're just going to have a look at the background then. So the who are the big three? You'll hear this name bandied about, but as it says here, sometimes they're referred to as the Allied powers, sometimes the victors, because they were the side who won World War I, and sometimes, more commonly in your GCSE questions, by AQA, they are referred to as the big three. So they are Britain, France, and the United States of America, and they had been allies. They had fought together in World War I. So at the end of World War I, when Germany were defeated, it was up to the Allied powers to decide what their punishment was going to be, what the end of the war was going to look like, and that's what the Paris Peace Conference did, and in the end what the Treaty of Versailles outlined what peace was going to look like. So we've got to see what each of them wanted and why, and then what they actually got, because it wasn't like they all wanted the same thing and it was really easy and they just went in, and because it wasn't just them, there were 30 different countries at the Paris Peace Conference, but it was these three who would in the end deciding what was going to happen, and they had different wants, different needs, and there were different reasons why. So France, now you may or may have not studied World War I recently. You might have done it in Key Stage 3, you might not have looked at it in your GCSE studies, but you should know that France was mainly fought on the Western Front in France and, World War I was mainly fought on the Western Front in France and Belgium. So France had been badly damaged during the war, okay? There's actually an area the size of Holland, the country, was damaged by World War I and the fighting in France. So they lost thousands, many thousands of soldiers during the conflict, and a lot of the land that they lost was actually full of their infrastructure, their industry, that kind of thing. So they lost a lot and they really wanted revenge on Germany here. Britain had also lost a lot of a lot of soldiers during the war, and the United States, they only joined in 1917. They only actually lost 100,000 soldiers, which sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, but comparatively to the other two of the big three, they hadn't lost as much, so they weren't as much looking for revenge as Britain and France were. So let's just have a look then at what the different countries' stances were. So France, they suffered greatly during the war. Over half of the soldiers that they sent to the front were wounded, and over an eighth were killed. Now, they had been invaded by Germany a number of times in the preceding decades. Now, the big one of this was 1871, and the leader of France, who represented France at the Paris Peace Conference, Georges Clemenceau, had experienced this. So he'd been there in 1871. He was also there in 1914 when it happened again. So in Clemenceau's opinion, in terms of what France thought, they are now fed up of Germany attacking them. So it's happened in 1871, it's happened in 1914, and Clemenceau wants to weaken Germany so much that there's no way that they can attack France again. So they are wary of Germans and their military ambitions, and they wanted to weaken, work on my highlighter, they wanted to weaken Germany severely, so as much as possible, so that they could not attack France again. But, and this is the key word here, Clemenceau knew that he had to compromise, because what he wanted to do was completely get rid of their military, but then that was not fair, because if somebody was to attack Germany, how are they going to defend themselves? So that's something we'll come back to. So he didn't want to look weak, and he wanted to punish Germany as much as possible. So the two key words here for France and Clemenceau are revenge and punishment. Okay, they're really the two things that he wants for Germany: punishment and revenge. So, slightly different stance now from the USA. Woodrow Wilson is the member of, he's the president at the time who is representing the USA, and he's all about building a better world. Okay, remember, he doesn't want revenge. He wants the world to grow, learn from the war, and learn how to cooperate with each other. Woodrow Wilson had a very, very big belief in people. He believed that people would always do the right thing. So if you allow the people to elect the government will reflect the people. When the people don't like what the government are doing, they will tell the government. And he really believed that people would do the right thing, whether rightly or wrongly. That's what he believed. So he was all about giving people the opportunity to prove themselves and to make a difference. So he didn't want the world to resort to war. So he did not want them to resort to war to deal with problems. He wanted a fairer world, and he did not think that Germany should be punished for the war. So he didn't want the treaty to be too harsh. He said if Germany was treated particularly badly, then it could provoke another war. 100% right, because 20 years after this peace treaty was signed, World War II breaks out. So he believed that countries should be working together to solve the problems, that democracy should be the prevailing ideas in running countries. So opposite to what we get in Hitler and his dictatorship. So he puts forward the idea of a League of Nations, and he wanted countries to talk about their problems rather than fighting them out in a war. He wanted them to be able to rule themselves, and he wanted to see the end of empires. He didn't really, his ideas weren't really popular with the other two, because remember, they were focused on punishment, but he had 14 points. I'm not going to read through them all. If you would like to read through them, you can pause the video here and have a read through them, because we don't have time to go through them all. But he did have 14 points of what he wanted the Treaty of Versailles to outline, and they were kind of ridiculed by the other countries. Lord George said even God only has 10 commandments. So he wanted a lot, and it was all based around this idea of peace and this idea of cooperation going forwards. Then we've got Britain, David Lloyd George. He is a Liberal MP, and he wants a middle ground. Okay, so if we have a look on like a spectrum, we've got, if you've got like left and right in terms of what we want to happen to Germany, on the left here we've got Wilson. On the right we've got Clemenceau. And in the middle we've got David Lloyd George. Okay, so he really wants a middle ground, for it to be fair, but still for there to be some punishment in there. So he had campaigned in 1918, and he said, if you elect me, I will make Germany pay. So he has to have some kind of punishment in there, because that's what the British people wanted. He wanted to stop German threats to the British Empire, and he wanted to protect British jobs. So bit about protecting himself and his own country, bit about actually bringing around this punishment for Germany. He wanted, again, he said, as Wilson did, he didn't want to provoke another war. We know that it did. He wanted to make sure that trade with Germany could carry on. So he said, he thought if you cripple the German economy too much, like Clemenceau wanted, then we couldn't carry on trading with Germany. So he wanted to strike a balance here. So he didn't want British people to lose their jobs, because he didn't want to lose an election. Remember, politicians often do things for their own sake rather than the sake of the people. It might not have been what the British people wanted, but he wanted to make sure that they didn't lose their jobs. So he is actually looking at the bigger picture here. So the British public wanted to punish Germany harshly. So the key thing here is a balance. Okay, he wants to punish Germany, but not too harshly. So let's have a look at whether they actually achieve these aims then. In the next video, we're going to be looking at the actual terms of the Treaty of Versailles in a bit more detail. But let's just have a look here at what they wanted. So clemenceau, punishment and revenge. Germany and its allies did have to accept responsibility for starting the war. They accepted the blame for it. However, they wanted Germany to be destroyed, not weakened, and Germany was just weakened. And they didn't actually get the revenge they wanted, and they voted him out of office in the next election. They believed that he didn't get France what they deserved. He wanted protection, reduction of Germany's armed forces. The German army and navy were reduced. However, he thought they should not be allowed an army at all. Recover losses and reparations. They had 6.6 million, and it had actually cost them 200 billion. So they got some money back, but they didn't get enough money back. So you can see he got some things he wanted, he didn't get others. And this is what we're talking about, this compromise. That's why the compromise is so important. So Woodrow Wilson of the USA, he wanted self-determination. Some people did get independence. Parts of the German Empire were given to the League of Nations, which we will go into in a future video, but Britain and France ran them. So even if these countries were independent, they still weren't ruling themselves. They were still being ruled by other people. So he did get the League of Nations. Ironically, though, America doesn't join it. So that's what he doesn't get here. They did agree together to work to keep the peace, although that doesn't happen. There are still a lot of wars that go on in the 1920s. Wilson felt that the Treaty of Versailles was so harsh that Germany would seek revenge and another war would follow, which, as we've said, is exactly what happens. So David Lloyd George and Britain, he wants revenge and reparations for the people of Britain. The war guilt clause pleased the British people, where Germany had to accept responsibility for starting the war. They got reparations. Again, Lloyd George worried that the treaty was too harsh. The German army was heavily reduced, as was their navy, so he was able to retain naval supremacy. The Britain managed to keep the biggest navy in the world. Retain a trade relationship with Germany. Now, this didn't happen because they weren't in a strong relationship. Now, the reparations would destroy the economies of Europe. In the 1920s in Germany, you get massive hyperinflation. Okay, so because they've got to pay all of this money back, and remember that even though they did fight and they did lose, they did still suffer. So they've still got to rebuild their own economy. They have lost a lot of men as well. And in the 1920s, to do that, they start printing more money. Now, what happens when you print money is it loses its value. So imagine you've got a special edition of something. If there were 20 million special editions, it's no longer that special. If there's 10 of them, they become worth a lot more, don't they? So imagine you've got 10 of something that's worth £10 each, then you make 50 more of them. They're going to become worth a lot less because there's more of them. So if you've got money and you print loads of money, sounds like a quick fix, sounds like everybody should be doing it, money becomes worth less. So what actually cost like £1, say for a loaf of bread, would then end up costing 100 and then 1,000. So what you get in Germany in the 1920s is, you can see pictures, if you Google hyperinflation 1920s, you can see pictures of children playing with wheelbarrows full of money because it isn't worth anything. It costs millions of marks, they were called at this time in Germany. It cost millions of marks to get a loaf of bread, and you literally had to take a wheelbarrow of money everywhere with you that you went, obviously with no credit cards and things at that time. So the Treaty of Versailles and Germany having to pay all this money out actually does a lot of damage and doesn't benefit the other countries that are trading with Germany. At the end of the First World War, the British Empire is bigger, done it again, than it was before, and they gained territory from the German Empire. But again, he said 25 years time, it was actually only 20 years time, and the cost would be double that of the first. Okay, so you can see they're coming from different stances, the big three, and they've got different aims. Each of them get some of them and don't get others, because remember the key word here, it's all about compromise. Okay, so in the next video, we're going to go over what the Treaty of Versailles actually said and what that meant for Germany. Okay, so hopefully you will tune into that one. Thank you for tuning into this one, and I'll see you as our series continues.